The Battle of Brompt gave us a superiority over the enemy which we did not afterwards lose. General Oche continued advancing on the right of the enemy. He succeeded in turning his position near Permesson. And a few days later, while debouching from behind the mountains, the two French armies met near Weissenberg. The enemy, discouraged, began to retreat, and Landau was delivered. Pichegru's fame was, from that moment, firmly established. He also displayed his character in a trait I must not omit. General Desaix was of noble extraction, but the decree that excluded all noblemen had not yet been applied to him. The commissioners of the convention hesitated to deprive the army of an able, valiant, and beloved officer. The Committee of Public Safety, nevertheless, sent 3 times to Pichegru orders to dismiss him, but he did not obey them, and even took care not to mention the fact to anyone. It was not till the campaign was over that Desaix learned of it. Thus, by his generous disobedience, he saved a general who, during 10 years, shed luster on the armies of France, and whose noble character may be offered as a model to all soldiers. The junction of the two armies after such great successes was a beautiful scene. The generals congratulated one another on their mutual exertions, but discord soon created between them dissensions more dangerous than even the enemy had proved. Each pretended to the greatest share of the glory, and wounded vanity would perhaps have soiled the field with blood, had not government checked the misunderstanding by separating the commanders. Pichegru was sent to the northern army, and Oche to that which was assembled near Nice. He had scarcely arrived there when he was arrested and shut up in the dungeon of the Conciergerie, where he remained until after the 9th of Thermidor. Thus, the Committee of Public Safety made him expiate his glory and humbled his proud character. The Army of the Rhine pursued its success during the remainder of the year 1794. Our position on the Queiche was secure. The Austrians had repassed the Rhine. We had some other brilliant actions with the Prussians, and I remember that at the close of one of them that had proved entirely to our advantage, in the environs of Germersheim, we saw the words chalked on the doors of a village we had taken: "Adieu, brave Frenchmen." A short time after, the Treaty of Basel was signed and established friendship between two nations which already esteemed one another. The common hatred awoke again at a more recent period, and a long time will now be required to suppress it. In the month of October, the army established itself before Mentz to keep the enemy in awe and prevent him from advancing on that point. The soldiers constructed huts underground in a very ingenious manner. Protected by field fortifications that covered this new sort of camp, they passed there one of the longest and severest winters ever recorded. The result aimed at in taking that position was obtained, at least during 6 months, but it was too dearly bought. In the month of January, 1/2 of the army lay sick in the hospitals. In June, the enemy again began his operations, and, as we might have foreseen, he crossed the Rhine behind us, turned our position, and obliged us to fall back on the Lutter. General Moreau came to take command of the Army of the Rhine. The history of that campaign is known. I shall therefore enter into no particulars concerning it. I left the army a little while before its retreat. General Delisle had just got out of prison and had been appointed chief of the staff of the 1st Military Division of Paris. He proposed to me to return and resume my duties as aide-de-camp. I was happy in the army, but I wished to see my family once more, so I set off. Before I leave the Army of the Rhine, to which I shall not again allude, I must beg permission to take leave of it with a few lines. That army was by no means the first, either by its consequence or its exploits. Its duty was to protect Alsatia and defend that part of the Palatinate it had conquered. It succeeded by battles strongly disputed, but in the issue always favorable, and it was of great service to France. For the enemy coveted that part of our frontier that he would perhaps never have restored. Lorraine is the cradle of the imperial house, and the Germans look upon Alsatia as a part of the empire which it is as much to their advantage as their honor to unite again to the mother country. There prevailed the same language, the same customs, the same religion, and above all, the strong wish of weakening France and enabling themselves to attack her in the very heart. The plan is not yet given up. The army of the Rhine shared at that period with our other armies the advantage of being commanded by generals and officers, almost all of whom had risen from its own ranks and been instructed among them. At the head of the most able must be placed Kléber, Desaix, and Saint-Cyr. Kléber was born at Strasbourg. He had served before the Revolution in the Austrian army, and he came to ours as commander of a battalion of volunteers of the Upper Rhine. His stature was strong, gigantic, and called to mind the heroes of Homer. His voice was sonorous and imperious. His spirit rose and warmed at the sight of danger. Though he learned in all the branches of military science, he was not gifted with that boldness of execution that distinguished other generals, but he possessed the prudence which long experience gives, joined to the resources deprived of an imperturbable coolness and a rapid perception. Of all of our generals, Kléber is perhaps the one of whom the soldiers retain the most flattering recollection, for he loved them as if they had been his children, was continually thinking of their comforts, and diverted them in the midst of their perils by quaint sayings, which were rendered more piquant by the harsh accent of his mother tongue. Desaix, who was born in Auvergne, had served for several years as an officer in the regiment of Brittany. His stature was tall and his figure singular. He had fine, black, fiery eyes and a nose that seemed to descend from the top of the forehead. His thick and unusually separated lips showed a set of teeth of sparkling whiteness. His hair, flat and black as jet, shaded his dark face. His gait was embarrassed, but still without awkwardness, and betrayed bashfulness and a want of knowledge of the world. Altogether, he resembled a savage of the banks of the Orinoco, dressed in French clothes. But one soon got accustomed to him. His voice was soft, and when once drawn out of his usual reserve, he delighted by the variety of his information and the simplicity of his manners. He had none of the faults of men accustomed to camp life. I never heard him utter a vulgar expression. An indecent word made him blush. As he was constantly easy and kind, his staff led a merry life, and the pretty girls of the Palatinate used frequently to visit his headquarters. He smiled at our pleasures without sharing them, but with the indulgence of a father who shuts his eyes on his child's wild tricks. I do not think I ever saw him dressed in the uniform of his rank. He usually wore a blue coat without any lace, and the sleeves of which were so short that we used to say in jest he had certainly worn it when he first took the sacrament. He frequently mounted his horse without a sword when he went to visit the posts. One night, having ordered an attack on the convent of Marienborn near Mentz, which the enemy occupied in force, he suddenly found himself without arms in the midst of a surprised body of infantry, which was defending itself with the bayonet amongst the vines. Desaix, perceiving he had forgot his sword, pulled a vine prop out of the ground and continued fighting as if he had had Orlando's sword in his hand. Savary, who was then his aide-de-camp, threw himself before him just in time to save his life and killed a Hungarian grenadier who was about to pierce him with his bayonet. I must not forget General Saint-Cyr, though still alive and in the enjoyment of power, but this work is not meant to appear till after my death. He entered the army as captain of a free corps raised in Paris during the terrible month of September 1792. This troop, which consisted of Parisian vagabonds, I need not say any more, boasted on the road that they were going to teach the army the right step, meaning that they would make it Republican, for, to say the truth, we were neither robbers nor braggers. However, they committed such terrible outrages that General Custine ordered his cavalry to surround and disarm them, after which they were disbanded. Saint-Cyr remained in consequence unemployed. He had in his early youth visited as an artist Italy and Greece, and he had a great facility for drawing. One day he was busy near Mentz sketching the positions of Ockheim when General Custines, whose glance was piercing, observed him at a distance, darted towards him with all the swiftness his horse was capable of. Seeing him dressed in a uniform he detested, he asked him angrily what he was doing and tore the paper out of his hands. Finding, however, that the positions were taken accurately, he asked him some questions, appeared satisfied with his answer, and appointed him officer of the staff. A few months afterwards, and shortly before our disaster at Weissenberg, chance was still more serviceable to him. We had been repulsed in the pass of Annweiler. The commissioners of the convention, seeing treason everywhere, knew not to whom they ought to entrust the command of the troops. Saint-Cyr was crossing the street under the windows of the headquarters. An officer pointed to him as a man in whom the greatest confidence might be placed. He was called upstairs, and, after a few questions, the commissioners proposed to him to march off with 200 men and attack the enemy. His surname, Gouvion, however, made them frown. The same had been that of a friend of Monsieur de Lafayette, a former major general of the National Guards of Paris. Though the latter had been killed in the army, his relations were not the less persecuted for that. Saint-Cyr beat the enemy, made some 100 prisoners, and retook the positions. 3 months later, he was a general of division. He constantly commanded the center of the army and was called its shield. Next to these celebrated generals shone a great number of young men who have all acquired lasting glory. Saint-Suzanne, Guyot, Brussier, Belezesne, Ferrino, Axo, Doda, Nemta, Clemenceau, Friron, Destrel, and the unfortunate La Hourie, so praiseworthy for his constancy of spirit, which 10 years' adversity was enabled to shake, and who received death with a smile. And you also, my old chiefs, my dear friends, why can I surround your names with all the splendor of your noble deeds? You greatly contributed to save France. Could you expect that your services would one day be rewarded by forgetfulness and persecution? With such chiefs and friends of the soldiers, most of whom had commanded as private officers, discipline was exact but gentle. They all loved their profession and were well acquainted with it. Mean jealousy, hatred, and backbiting were unknown. The oldest of these generals was scarcely 30, and the revolution having found them in a middling condition, and at a time of life when luxury and corruption have not yet gained an empire over the mind, they had no wish but for glory, and glory itself pleased them only when surrounded by perils. I have frequently heard doubts raised as to the skill of our generals, notwithstanding the constant successes by which their fame has been established. It has been declared impossible to learn so quickly and so well the most difficult of all sciences, and that which more than any other requires a number of different branches of knowledge, which can only be acquired by a great deal of time, particularly where the peculiar education is wanting, as was the case with most of the Republican generals. It is not sufficiently known that the first quality necessary to attain distinction in the military career is strength of mind, that gift of nature which is so little esteemed and of so little use in ordinary life, is, however, so important that it might have saved France a few years ago if those who at that time influenced her fate had been possessed of it. It is quite indispensable in the military profession. Nature alone can give it, and she did give it to all of our celebrated generals. In the second place, it is not true that their education had been neglected. For to speak only of those of the first period of the war, Pichegru, Bernadotte, Jourdan, Moreau, Kléber, Desaix, Saint-Cyr, and Hoche, the latter was bred at the School of the Sons of the Gardes Françaises, had all studied the military art. The education of most of them had been as well attended as to that of the nobility. It must also be considered that in other professions, the most ambitious student can scarcely devote more than 12 hours a day to his studies and is frequently interrupted, whereas in the army, every instant is given up to military knowledge. A passion for glory, ambition, the pleasure of command, freedom from the duties of the world, all induce soldiers to talk and think unceasingly of their profession. The variety of events, their rapidity, their number, hourly correct the wrong judgment of young officers, enrich their memory, multiply the examples they may want, and complete their improvement. Their mistakes appear in open daylight. They are quickly punished. And as the blow strikes not only the guilty, but also those who are placed below or around him, each individual is in some respect answerable for his neighbor, and all have the greatest interest in acting well. The composition of the troops, as well as their valor, contributed also to our successes. The love of their country and the hatred of a foreign yoke had animated them, even under the paternal roof, since the year 1789. At the first call, the citizens flew to the frontiers, a great number of well-educated young men whom the passion for glory and ambition had assembled under the banners of the army were like a nursery of excellent officers. The warlike Marseillaise hymn filled every breast with such deep emotion and enthusiasm that its first notes were sufficient to make the troops rush on the enemy with irresistible impetuosity. At Geesburg, near Weissenberg, the enemy had crowned the plateau with 30 cannons, which dealt death and devastation into our ranks. The troops advanced nevertheless with a slow step. When they arrived at the foot of the frontier, the warlike song was heard, and at the same instant the soldiers, as if they had been borne up by a whirlwind, overcame every difficulty. The position was taken. The cannon were in our power, and the enemy put to flight. The perils and sufferings our troops endured at that period were the more deserving of admiration, because they had no other compensation than the love of their country and their ambition. The most simple enjoyments were unknown to us. We were all of us poor. The soldier received no more than an écu per month in money, and the officers of all ranks only 8 francs. Our salaries were paid us in assignats, which were already depreciated in France and were of no value at all in foreign countries. During the severe winter of 1794, I shared with some of my comrades a peasant's room in the village of Fintheim, near Metz. We had only one bed among us, and every week we drew lots who was to sleep in it. The rest lay upon straw. Our assignats were barely sufficient to procure us a little bad wine 3 times a month. We knew that our landlord possessed a considerable quantity, but not one of us ever cherished the idea of forcing him to give it to us for nothing. My companions were all young officers of engineers. 3 of them, Haxo, Doda, and Nemke, became celebrated generals in that corps. The rest were killed. I beg pardon for having dwelt so long on this subject. To the Army of the Rhine, I owe those qualities that have embellished my life and the strength of mind that decided my fate. When I entered it, I was full of enthusiasm, but my ideas on military subjects were confused, and I wanted experience. I had not yet seen the enemy, and I was very anxious to know what figure I should cut in the first battle. My ardent courage did not leave me at full liberty for reflection, but I was lucky enough to be attached to the division of General Desaix. The easy and immovable calmness, the soft cheerfulness of that excellent man in the midst of the most murderous fire made me sensible that there exists no real valor without those qualities. I reflected seriously and was discontented with myself. I did not know how to manage my horse when in the direction of the balls. I crossed too rapidly the field of action, and I frequently went a roundabout way when I could have rode straight before me. I blushed at such foolish conduct and schooled myself so well that case shot soon lost all power of embarrassing me. It required time, and I arrived at that degree of self-possession. How often did I not go back and place myself purposely in the middle of fire? How satisfied I was when I had remained long in such a situation. That moral strength did not contribute considerably to my advancement, but it made me worthy of being an aide-de-camp of the conqueror of Italy and gained me his esteem. It also made me bear prosperity with moderation and was a strong support to me in the days of misfortune. I arrived in Paris towards the middle of August. When I left that city in 1792, the people, freed from the wholesome restraint of the laws, intoxicated with fury and elated with their abominable triumphs, were madly enjoying a savage licentiousness, and ever-threatening, ever-oppressive, set no bounds to their tyranny. What change did I not find after the short space of 3 years? Scarcity was terrible, misery at the highest pitch, and the dethroned sovereign scarcely dared to complain. The people were no better than a vile rabble, devoid of energy, shrinking under the rod that chastised them, but having not even the thought of resistance. In the morning, the city presented a deplorable spectacle. Thousands of women and children were sitting on the stones before the doors of the baker's shop, waiting their turn for receiving a dearly bought bit of bread. More than 1/2 of Paris lived on potatoes. Paper money was without value and bullion without circulation. This lasted nearly a year. A still stranger sight struck the observer's eyes. The unfortunate prisoners had recovered their liberty, and having escaped almost certain death, they enjoyed their good luck with a sort of ecstasy. The dangers to which they had been so long exposed excited a lively interest in their favor. But vanity, so ingenious in France, discovered the means of turning their situation to advantage. Each person pretended to have suffered more than his neighbor. And, as it was the fashion to have been persecuted, a great many people who had remained safe in their hiding places or had bought their security by base concessions boasted of having languished in prison. An immense number of innocent persons had, in fact, perished on the scaffold. But if credit could have been given to the accounts propagated by hatred and vanity, one might have thought that 1/2 of Paris had imprisoned or butchered the other half. Confusion was at this period at its highest pitch in society. All distinctions of rank had disappeared. Wealth had changed possessors, and as it was still dangerous to boast of birth and to recall the memory of former gentility, the possessors of newly acquired wealth led the tone and added the absurdities of a bad education to those of patronage devoid of dignity. The class of artists, more commendable, acquired consideration through the general thirst for amusement and through the necessity many persons were in of seeking a livelihood in the arts of imagination. This same taste for the fine arts, so universally diffused, caused in the fashions and even in the morals of the metropolis a most inconceivable licentiousness. The young men dressed their hair en victime, that is to say, raised up at the back of the neck as if they were going to suffer on the scaffold. The women, on the contrary, imitated in their dresses the costumes of ancient Greece. It is scarcely credible to those who have not seen it. The young females, well bred and distinguished by their birth, should have worn tight skin-colored pantaloons, sandals on their feet, and transparent gauze dresses, while their bosoms were exposed and their arms bare up to their shoulders. And that when they appeared thus in the public spaces, instead of making modesty blush, they became objects of universal admiration and applause. The palaces and private gardens were changed into scenes of riotous pleasure, called Elysium, Paphos, Tivoli, Idalia, etc., where crowds of people, boisterous diversions, bad manners, and an utter contempt for decency created both shame and disgust.